Okay, today's lecture is going to be on the article The Evolutionary Debunking of Morality by Richard Joyce. That's in your textbook starting on page 597. Let's put this into context. So, last time you read the philosophy files on morality, and you also looked at Plato's famous challenge of why be moral. I'm going to set Plato's challenge aside for now and focus on the context provided by the philosophy files. In the philosophy files, he looked at three places where we might say morality comes from. From us, and one example of that was the Buhara theory, and the other one was the feelings theory. So in other words, what makes moral claims true, like stealing is wrong or whatever, is some fact about us. So stealing is wrong if and only if I feel that it's wrong. Now that just doesn't seem right. And one of the reasons it doesn't seem right is it looks like moral claims are claims that we can genuinely disagree over. So if I say stealing is wrong and you say stealing is right, we must be disagreeing. Whereas on the feelings view, both of them could be true at once, because when I say stealing is wrong, it means that I feel bad when I think of stealing, and you say stealing is okay, you don't feel that. And both of those could be true because we feel different ways. But what most philosophers would say is that moral claims are not like that. If I say stealing is wrong and you say it's right, we're genuinely disagreeing over something. And the way to make sense of that is the third theory that Stephen Law looked at of where morality comes from, and that is that morality is just when we make moral claims, we're referring to some objective feature of the world. Sometimes it helps to give an analogy with math. So for example, 2 plus 2 equals 4. Is that a matter of opinion? So if somebody else says 2 plus 2 equals 5, maybe they could be right? No. 2 plus 2 just does equal 4. But why? Well, there's actually disagreement about that. Some people argue it's because that numbers objectively exist. But this is rather a strange thing to claim. We do easily believe that there exist two of things. For example, I'm holding up 2 fingers. So there exist 2 fingers. But the number 2, does that exist? Where? I mean, can you see it? You can see 2 things, but you can't see the number 2 itself. If I write out the number 2, that's just something that refers to the number 2. It's not the number 2 itself. So there are the same kind of questions about mathematical entities, like numbers, that you see mentioned in this Richard Joyce article about moral facts. Realists about numbers say that numbers really exist. So for example, Plato might say they exist because there is a form of a number. If you remember Plato's theory of the forms, where he says that our world is actually of a lesser level of reality than the world of the forms. So that would be being a realist about numbers. And a realist about moral facts says that it's just true that, say, torturing babies for fun is wrong. It's just a fact. It's a fact in the same way that I'm holding a pen is a fact. Now, I'm holding a pen is a fact because there is something that really exists out in the world that makes my claim I'm holding a pen true. And that is me actually holding a pen. So torturing babies is wrong, on this theory, must refer to something out there existing independently of humans, or existing independently of individual humans, that makes torturing babies for fun is wrong true. What is that moral fact? Now, even amongst the moral realists, there is disagreement about this. Actually, as Joyce does, I should distinguish between realists and objectivists. Now, realists are objectivists. That is, if I am a realist about moral facts, I think that they objectively exist independently of us. But you can be an objectivist without being a realist. That is, you can be a constructivist. So, for example, here's another analogy. I'm kind of getting into the deep end, but this will provide good background when we get into Joyce's actual article. Race in humans. Does race exist? Well, it exists on census forms. It says, what is your race? And it gives you a list of options. Now, what's interesting is that the list of options changes. And that seems weird. If races were real things, how is it that races could change from one census to the next? For example, is being Hispanic a race? Some people treat it as a race. Other people say it's an ethnicity, which is different from a race. So, for example, you can say on some census forms it says white Hispanic. So that implies that white is the race and Hispanic is the ethnicity. Whereas some Hispanics refer to being Hispanic as their race. So what is it? Well, if you're a biological realist about race, you say, well, there's an actual fact existing out in the world that determines what race you are, say in your DNA. Now, what biologists tell us is that that's just false. You can look at someone's DNA and it will not tell you what race they are. So you could take the DNA of someone born in Africa, a typical, say, Nigerian, if there is such a thing as a typical Nigerian, but let's say, there's a particular tribe in parts of East Africa called the Luo tribe, where they are very dark complected indeed, almost blue-black. For example, the Pistons player Thon Maker looks like a member of the Luo tribe. He has very, very dark complexion. So take Thon Maker, for example, and take me. Most people would classify me as white. Most people would classify him as black. Take our DNA. Can't you tell from our DNA what our race is? And biologists say, no, you can't. There just is. Race doesn't have a biological, doesn't track biology. So does that mean that race isn't real? Well, if you're a constructivist, you say, no, that doesn't mean that race isn't real. It just means that it is a social fact. It is a category that we use, kind of like cool. Cool is a category that people get classified into, even though, of course, there's no biological component to being cool. But we still say, oh yeah, sure, I can tell who's cool and who isn't, because it's a social fact, and I know the rules for being cool, and if you pass the rules, then you're cool, and if you don't, then you're not. And race might be like that, like a socially constructed idea. Now, constructivism isn't objectivist, but at the same time it's not subjectivist. In other words, whether or not you're cool isn't something that is independently decidable for individual people. It is a social fact. And so I could be wrong about who's cool because I don't know the social rules for who classifies, and that could be true of race. So in other words, what race you are might be something that is a fact independent of your opinion without being sort of real in the sense that a realist might say, because it's dependent on society, dependent on society's mood. And it might change, as being cool does change very often. And race appears to change. So, and of course, actually, the terms that classify people according to their race are dependent on different cultures. So, for example, in the United States, it appears to be inherited. So, if two siblings both share both parents, so they're full siblings, then they cannot be different races according to the way that we understand race in the United States. But of course, you can get examples, you look it up online, of even twins where one of them appears to be white and the other one appears to be black. Now in Brazil, one of them could be white and the other one black, because their racial categories are entirely based on skin color. So if you are very pale, you can count as white, even if you have a full sibling who counts as black. So they have a skin color based category of race, and we have an inherited category of race. Who's right? They're both right, according to constructivists, because they're following the rules that are constructed by their society, and we're following the rules that are constructed by ours. Maybe moral facts are like that. That would allow different moral facts in different cultures. Okay, so Stephen Law's third answer to where moral facts come from, where morality comes from, it just is. It is a fact about the universe. There are degrees to how this could be the case. So it might be that you could say it's just a fact in the United States that race is inherited, without it being a fact that race is actually a real biological thing. Or according to the biological realist, no, race really is biological. It's not up to cultures to decide. It's just a scientific fact, in the same way that H2O is water is a scientific fact. Okay, that's some background. Now we're going to look at a challenge to morality, challenge to the idea that moral claims are true, in the way that this that Stephen Law's third idea about where morality comes from wants to say. So, objectivists about morality say it's just out there. If I say torturing babies for fun is wrong, it's because it's actually a real fact about the world. It's nothing to do with my feelings. It's a fact about the world that torturing babies is in fact wrong. But in the Stephen Law article, we saw, the aliens, Blib and Blob, saying, but where is this wrongness? I can't see it. So you have to explain what about the world determines that torturing babies for fun is wrong. It obviously is not something that can be detected by scientific influence. So where is it? What makes it true? And there are different answers. And one answer that Richard Joyce refers to, and I've mentioned before, is a theory called Utilitarianism, which argues that what makes something right or wrong is the amount of happiness that it causes. So lying in general is wrong because it tends to make people unhappy, but in particular circumstances it might be okay, say as lying to a murderer who wants to know where your friend is. That might be okay because in that instance lying actually brings about more happiness than telling the truth. But notice that's an objective answer to the question, what makes something wrong? The amount of happiness in the world. It's not something that's up to my feelings. So I might believe that lying in all cases is okay because I have no problem with it. But I would be wrong if it happened that my lying caused more unhappiness than if I told the truth. So, a contemporary, well, actually since Darwin, a challenge to objectivism about moral facts is the evolutionary theory of how we came to be. Now, we all know Darwin's theory of how the species came to look the way they are. We were talking about that earlier in the semester, about the tortoises on Galapagos, how the ones that lived in lush islands where there's plenty to eat, they had regular shells, and the ones that lived on islands where there was sparse vegetation and it tended to be up high, they had that little lip on the front of their shells and they had longer necks. And Darwin's theory of natural selection explains how the ones with the lip on their shells came to look that way. It's because if they hadn't looked that way, they would have died out, and it so happened by random mutation, some regular tortoises produced offspring with longer necks, and they tended to survive and pass on their long-neckedness to their offspring. And the way that that is framed in evolutionary terminology, is it's said that in that context, the context where the food was up high, having a long neck was adaptive. In other words, it makes you better suited for survival in the environment you're in. So now evolutionary theorists have expanded the range of things that they think evolution can explain to include things like features of our society, including moral concepts. So some evolutionary theorists have argued that morality, the reason why we have morality, can be explained in evolutionary terms. It's because it too is adaptive. We have come to be the type of beings that firmly believe in moral truths simply because the beings that did not have this belief in moral truth died out because they were less susceptible to survive and pass on this trait to their offspring. So this explains why we came by our moral beliefs. And we do have moral beliefs. We all, even children have very firmly held moral beliefs. They say that's not fair if they see their sibling getting one, M&M more than them. So they have this notion of fairness. So moral beliefs are firmly ingrained in us from a very young age. Now we get better at them, and certainly our moral beliefs become more subtle as we get older, but humans, they seem to be a fact of most humans. And the evolutionary theorist says, well, I can explain, just in the same way that, opposable thumbs were adaptive because they allowed us to pick things up and use tools. So having moral beliefs is adaptive. Well, but why? Why is having moral beliefs adaptive? That's something that the individual theorist has to explain. And a common, we'll look at what Michael Roos says in a little bit as to why having moral beliefs is adaptive. Interestingly, this appears to fit with Socrates' position and against the position of the immoralist suggested by Glaucon and Adeimantus in the previous reading, because they seem to suggest that being unjust was much more likely to succeed. If you were unjust, you were much more likely to be happy and successful. Whereas this suggestion by the evolutionary theorist says, no, actually having moral beliefs is going to it appears to have been a more successful evolutionary strategy than being amoral. Anyway, that's the background. So, moral nativism, the first section in the Richard Joyce article. Here, he's just explaining his terminology. And as he says, it can be confusing because nativism means sort of inborn. And remember, we've come across the term innate before. Rationalists like Plato and Descartes believe that we have innate beliefs. We're born with beliefs. So is a nativist saying that our moral beliefs are inborn? No, not necessarily. So to distinguish this use of nativism as inborn from the way that he intends it, Joyce, and the way that evolutionary theorists intend it, he says nativism simply means that in an evolutionary context that the trait is an adaptation. The trait exists and was transmitted from our ancestors because it improved their reproductive fitness relative to competitors. That's what the thesis of moral nativism is, as he puts it on page 589, column 2. And he get to draw the distinction between inborn in the innate sense and this sense of adaptation. He says, an inborn but not adaptive feature might be genetic diseases like cystic fibrosis, or his example is Down syndrome. Down syndrome gives you certain disadvantages, but the people who have it, certainly they have it because of their genes or their chromosomes. So it's inborn, they're born with it, they didn't catch it later on, but it is not adaptive. It is not something that evolutionary theorists say that we have because it helped us succeed. It's just like a genetic fact. So that would be inborn but not adaptive. And then there's adaptive but not inborn, which is language use. So clearly being able to use language does help us survive, because it helps us communicate, and that's why we're so much more successful than animals without language. What he's saying is that the moral nativist claim is that moral concepts are like our use of language. It's something that we have come by, humans have come by them merely because it helps us succeed. Now that explanation, of course, that the only reason we have them is because it helps us succeed, seems to lend to skepticism about their truths. It's like if you found out our beliefs in beauty, our standards of beauty are just adaptive. They're us having standards of beauty has enabled us to survive. That might cause us to be skeptical that there really are objective standards of beauty, as for example Plato believes there are objective standards of beauty because there's the form of beauty. But if you found out, oh no, the only reason I believe in beauty is because having that kind of belief has caused me to, was adaptive to my ancestors, it seems to suggest, well, that doesn't seem to lend us to the idea that there actually are standards of beauty. So you can see why thinking of morality as our moral faculties as a product of evolution might lead one to be skeptical that our moral claims are true. And that indeed is Michael Ruse's claim, as we'll get to in a second. But we're still clearing up terminology. So moral nativism is the idea that the capacity to make moral judgments like that's wrong is a human adaptation. In other words, it's something that's arisen in humans through evolution. Now, moral nativism can cover a wide range of things. So you can believe this claim and it still leaves open a sort of diversity of versions of moral nativism. For example, you might believe that only the moral faculty is innate. That is, the ability to have moral beliefs is something that has been selected by evolution, but not particular moral beliefs. So he gives the example, the Naga warrior believes that it is, how does he put it, judges that beheading a foreigner is a noble act, but a Nebraska teen, we hope, does not believe this. But both of them have the firm convictions about morality. So it's the firm conviction that is inbred, but it is the content of the conviction, the particular moral claims that society provides. An analogy to this is my analogy, not Joyce's, is bird song. Birds are born with the ability to sing particular songs that enable them to recognize each other. But what they found is that if you isolate a baby bird from other birds through a critical window, it can't learn to sing. Now it was born with the faculty to sing, but you have to have specific exposure during a window before it would sing. And furthermore, if you expose it in that window to a different bird song, then that's the one it will learn. This is the more important analogy. So it will learn whatever song it is exposed to. It's born with the capacity to sing, but the particular song that it sings depends on what it's exposed to. So we're all humans are born with the capacity for making moral judgments, but which particular ones we believe depends on our cultural upbringing. That would be a moral nativist view. So our moral capacity could be dependent on certain conditions. Maybe not every human has it. Maybe some humans exist in circumstances that are so conducive to life that they didn't have to acquire this advantage. So by analogy, for example, the dodo. The dodo, of course, famously went extinct because humans are assholes. The dodo was a flightless bird that lived on an island with no predators. So it didn't have to, because it didn't have predators and because food was abundant, it didn't have to acquire the ability to fly. So consequently, and also it was very trusting apparently. So when humans arrived on the island, it sort of trotted up to the humans and said, hello, who are you? and promptly got killed and eaten and entirely exterminated, because again, humans are assholes. Whereas birds in countries that had predators, they very quickly evolved the ability to fly, and they had to, otherwise they died out. But maybe there are some humans that where they lived was fine, so they didn't have enemies and food was readily available, so they didn't have to acquire this evolutionary advantage to survive. So the moral capacity might not be universal. It also doesn't imply that there's a gene. We're always hearing that the gene for something is being discovered, like the gay gene or the humor gene or whatever, or the autism gene. These are rarely backed up by facts, and it certainly does. Moral nativism doesn't require that there be a gene for morality. There certainly isn't a gene for race, for example. And it doesn't imply, moral nativism doesn't imply that humans are by nature good. It just implies that they have a moral faculty. Their moral faculty might be very different from ours. As he says, Hitler and Mother Teresa might equally have a moral faculty and be guided by it. It's just that the content of their moral beliefs is very different. Hitler believes that it is a very moral thing to wipe out humans that might dilute the Aryan gene pool. Mother Teresa actually has been criticized. You probably don't know who Mother Teresa is. During my lifetime, she was held up as a sort of saint because she worked with the very, very poor and sick in the slums of Calcutta, which is a very poor Indian city. And she was a Catholic nun. But she's had her critics since she died because, being Catholic, of course, she was very opposed to birth control. So she wouldn't allow any of the people she was tending to use birth control, and consequently a lot of babies were born and starved to death in awful circumstances. So, you know, Mother Teresa has her critics too, but she's certainly not on a par with Hitler. But she's usually used as an example of a paragon of virtue. And what Joyce says is both of them, according to moral nativism, do have moral faculties. It's just their actual beliefs are different. Now then, the important question, he says, is moral judgment truth tracking? What this means is, if moral judgment was truth tracking, then the fact that it was arrived at by evolutionary means shouldn't mean that we should be skeptical about our moral judgments. So if it was truth tracking, then the fact that I believe barbecuing babies for fun is wrong shouldn't lead me to question that that's true. It should actually confirm that it's true, because it's a belief that that evolution has produced in me as a truth-tracking faculty. And an analogy for a truth-tracking faculty that might be evolutionarily installed is our numerical ability, our ability to count. 2 + 2 = 4 is something I believe very strongly. Now, the reason I believe it very strongly, say the evolutionary theorists, is because it was adaptive. But that doesn't lead me to believe, well, maybe 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4. I just believe it because it's adaptive. But it can't be adaptive unless it's true for mathematical beliefs. And he gives the example of, you know, whether or not there are lions around, or how many lions there are around, is something, my belief that, you know, there aren't lions around better be truth tracking, because otherwise I'm going to get eaten by lions. So certain beliefs that are evolution, a product of evolution, are truth tracking. Then the question is morality like that? Well, the theories, the debunking theories we're going to look at, all tend to assume that our moral faculties are not truth tracking. What's his example? Certainly our moral faculties produce truth evaluable judgments. That is, things that we can question whether or not they're true, because so I have a judgment like, I did something wrong. That's something that we could say, well, that could be true or it could be false. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's truth tracking, as we'll see. And sometimes you can have adaptive beliefs that are not truth tracking and in fact that are false. So he gives the example. He gives a fanciful example. Suppose the belief in the tooth fairy encouraged dental hygiene. Well, then it would be adaptive to believe in the tooth fairy, because having intact teeth will help you survive, because you can't eat very well without them. So we would expect evolution to produce cultures of people who believe in the tooth fairy. But that doesn't make us think, oh, there is a tooth fairy. So something can be evolutionarily adaptive without being truth tracking. And the question is our moral faculty like our numerical faculty that is truth tracking, or is it like this alternative belief in the tooth fairy? And of course, some evolutionary theorists say our belief in God is like that. It's adaptive, because if you believe in God, it makes you nicer to your fellow humans in a way, and encourage cooperation. But learning that our belief in God is not really a result of encountering God, but as a result of evolution favored people that believed in God, leads many people to question whether or not God actually exists. And exactly the same move is being used against morality. All right, so debunking. We're now on to the section called debunking on page 591. Joyce distinguishes between three kinds of debunking. The first kind he calls truth debunking, and by analogy he gives something that's very famous in philosophical circles. A guy called J.L. Mackie proposed an error theory of morality. He wrote a book about it in the 70s. He called it Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong. So the fact that he says inventing right and wrong gives you a clue as to what he thinks. He thinks that right and wrong are not real. We just say that they're real. And in fact, all beliefs, all moral claims that act as if there are moral facts that are true independently of us, all claims like that are false, he says. They are errors. So if I say barbecuing babies for fun is wrong, that implicitly contains a reference to a fact about the world, that it is wrong. It's a bit like me saying this cup is white. That makes a claim about the world that is either true or false. And whether or not it's true or false depends on the actual color of the actual cup. So me saying barbecuing babies for fun is wrong is making a claim about the real world. And so it would, by analogy, imply that, where people barbecue babies for fun, it has the feature of wrongness in the real world. And he says there just aren't such things as wrongness, so therefore all our moral claims are false. That is an error theory. And he says any evolutionary theorists who claim that evolution shows that moral claims are false in the way that Mackie says is a truth debunking evolutionary theorist. And that the example of that he goes on to in the next section is Michael Ruse's theory. So that Michael Ruse's theory is the strongest debunking. It says that basically all our moral claims are false. A different, less extreme kind of debunking, you know what debunking is, right? Debunking just means undermining. So if I say that Uri Geller's ability to bend spoons with his mind has been debunked, it shows that he didn't really do it with his mind. It was a trick. So the second kind of debunking he calls theory debunking. So there's truth debunking, then theory debunking. Theory debunking says moral claims like keeping promises is good might be true, but particular theories' explanation of why they're true, those theories can be shown to be false. So for example, if I say keeping promises is good is true because God said so, obviously I could debunk that theory if I could prove that God doesn't exist, or that God exists but never said that. That would be a theory debunking. It wouldn't show that it's false to say that keeping promise is good. So it doesn't show that all moral claims are false in the way that the truth debunking theory does. It just shows that particular theoretical accounts purporting to explain why our moral claims are true, those theories are false. Then there's the third kind of debunking, which he himself favors, is the justification debunking. So that shows not that our moral claims are false, but that we're not justified in believing them. So, for example, if I said, I don't know, they're going to shut down the French Hall later today. That's true. They're going to shut down French Hall later today. But suppose my reason for believing that was the voices in my head. I would have a true belief, but it would not be a justified belief. In other words, if you heard me say that, you probably shouldn't believe me because you know that I've acquired it in a way that is unjustified. So justification, you can have true beliefs that are unjustified. You can even have false beliefs that are justified. Maybe, somebody who's always told the truth told me this, but in fact they made a mistake for once. I would be justified because I would be getting it from a reliable source, but it would be false. So justification is different from truth. And the justification debunking shows that moral claims are not justified. Now, as he says, justification is relative. So sometimes I might be justified in believing something, and you might be unjustified in believing that very thing. But he says the strongest justification debunking would show that everyone at all times is unjustified in believing moral claims. But of course there are degrees of justification debunking. All right, so those are the three kinds: truth debunking, theory debunking, justification debunking. So then he devotes a section to each. So the first section following this is on the first kind. So evolutionary debunking of moral truth. That's the truth debunking. That's page 592, column 1. Now he says, first of all, we must be careful. The people trying to debunk the truth of things must be, particularly on evolutionary grounds, must be careful to avoid a well-known fallacy called the genetic fallacy. And if it's a fallacy, it's a way of thinking that you shouldn't use. And the genetic fallacy is, you commit the genetic fallacy when you say that something must be false because of where it came from. So, for example, if I said COVID-19 can't be dangerous because Trump says it's dangerous, and he always lies. Now that, you might say, sounds fairly sensible, but in general, particularly when it comes to theories, you shouldn't point to their source to show, as proof that they're false. So in other words, I can't prove that something is false just by pointing to where it came from, because even people that tell lies a lot of the time sometimes tell the truth. So I cannot prove something is false just by pointing to its source. When you do that with people, the genetic fallacy is a broad range of fallacies, but when it's applied to particular humans, it's called the ad hominem fallacy. And you commit that fallacy when you try to reject someone's view by attacking their character. So if I say, we shouldn't believe that, so-and-so says that lying is wrong, but I know for a fact that guy told a lie yesterday. That doesn't prove that lying isn't wrong. That doesn't demonstrate that lying isn't wrong. All right, so the genetic fallacy is a mistaken way of thinking. We must avoid it, but it does sound a bit like the debunkers of moral theory are committing this fallacy, because they're saying our moral faculty comes from evolution, and the fact that it comes from evolution proves that it's false. It must be the case that we avoid arguing just that. We have to do a better job than that. So let's look at what Michael Ruse, who is arguing this, he's arguing for a truth-debunking evolutionary theory. What does he say? Well, on page 592.2, column 2, he is quoted as saying, morality is a collective illusion foisted on us by our genes. Note, however, that the illusion lies not in the morality itself, but in its sense of objectivity. So the key point he's making is that our moral beliefs, we shouldn't trust that our moral beliefs are responding to an objective fact, and we're wrong to think that they are. And the argument goes something like this. First of all, there's his nativist account. So he says that having a faculty that issues moral judgment is adaptive. Now, his explanation of why it's adaptive is it strengthens our ancestors' motivation to cooperate. That's why it's adaptive. So if you believe in morality, if you make moral claims, you're more likely to cooperate. And cooperation is what makes us more likely to survive. So, in other words, we have morality because it's conducive to cooperation, and it's the cooperation itself that is adaptive. So that's why morality is adaptive, or that's why our belief in morality is adaptive. Now, the only way that our moral beliefs can have this effect of causing us to cooperate, that is adaptive, the only way that moral judgment can do that is if they claim to be objective. Because if they're entirely subjective, then that doesn't lead us to cooperate. It's only if we claim to agree on something, or this is a fact that brings us together, that it will have this effect of causing us to cooperate. So that explains, first of all, why morality or belief in moral claims is adaptive, and also why our moral claims tend to be objective. So we tend to believe that barbecuing babies for fun is wrong, not because I feel it, it just is wrong. So there's an objective fact. Of course you think that, says Ruse, because you're evolutionarily designed to think that. Once we know why we believe in morality, says Ruse, parsimony removes the need to assert that there are objective moral facts. What is parsimony? Well, remember when we talked about Occam's razor? Occam's razor said that if you're choosing between two explanations for something and you don't know which is the correct one, the way to choose is to choose the simpler one. And simpler in the sense of requires us to believe in the fewest number of things. So by Ruse's analogy is the popularity of spiritualism after World War I. Why were so many people believing in spirits after World War I? Why were Ouija boards suddenly hugely popular, and people were going in for seances all the time? Why? Well, here's two explanations. One is there were more spirits around. Suddenly people were more sensitive to the actual existence of spirits. The other explanation is so many mothers had lost their children in World War I that the grief was driving them to wish that they could contact with them, and this wish that they could contact them caused them to believe that they actually could through this means. Now, which is the correct explanation? Well, parsimony leads us to the second one, because it doesn't. The first one requires us to believe in spirits, which goes against all our scientific evidence. So it's much more sensible to believe that the reason why so many people believed in spiritualism after World War I was because so many people had died and they were so sad about that. So Ruse is saying that's analogous to the move that we should make. So here are the two explanations. Why do I believe that barbecuing babies for fun is wrong? One, because it actually is wrong. There's a moral fact out there in the universe that explains why it's wrong, and I'm picking up on that moral fact. Or two, evolution made me think that. Now, why should we favor this one? Because it doesn't require the existence of moral facts. Just like the spiritualism example, we should favor the one that doesn't require us to believe in spirits. So that's why that's what parsimony is, believing in fewer things. It's we're being less extravagant in our ontologies, is one way of putting it. Our ontologies is the things that we believe exist. So we want parsimonious ontologies. We want ontologies that are smaller. We believe so that don't include things like fairies and spirits and moral facts. Now, the author of the article says, yeah, I don't think this is a good analogy. We don't believe in spiritualism because it really would require us to introduce spirits. But moral facts aren't like spirits. And in fact, moral facts can be down to earth and not clash with science. For example, the moral facts that utilitarianism talks about. Utilitarianism, again, says things are objectively right or wrong depending on the happiness they bring about. Well, happiness, we already believe in. So if I say what makes things wrong is a fact about happiness, I'm not requiring that you believe in anything that you don't already believe in, but it still makes an objective moral fact. So, Roux's appeal to parsimony doesn't work against all objective moral counts. And so far, Roux is just a theory debunker, because he seems to be targeting only moral theories that claim to be objective. However, what makes Roux a truth debunker, that is, he says that all moral claims are untrue, is because Roux believes that all moral claims come with objectivity built in. So he quotes Roux at the bottom of the first column on page 593 of saying, ethics is subjective. In fact, it's just based on how we feel. But its meaning is objective. That is, the meaning of moral claims is objective. When I say that something is wrong, that comes built in with the claim that there's an objective fact about the world. So every moral fact comes built in with the claim that it is objective. And because of that fact, every moral fact is false. That's what makes Roux a truth debunker rather than a theory debunker. All right, talking of theory debunkers, let's go on and talk about them. And the example of someone who presents a theory debunking evolutionary account is Sharon Street. This is on page 593, column 2. Now, she allows that constructivism may be true. And remember, constructivism suggests that I gave you a constructivist account of race. That is, it's not based on biology, it depends on what your culture believes. So, for example, the concept of race in the United States is inherited. The concept of race in Brazil is based on skin tone. If morality is constructivist, is just sort of based on our cultural beliefs, then Sharon Street says, my theory doesn't threaten that. What my theory threatens is realist theories. That is, moral theories that say, no, it's not our culture that determines whether or not moral facts are true. It's the world, independent of what we think. And in fact, I think there are good reasons to be a realist rather than a constructivist, because constructivist theories tend to be also relativist theories. So you may have heard of moral relativism. According to moral relativism, whether or not slavery, for example, is wrong depends entirely on your culture. So, for example, in the antebellum United States, slavery was not wrong according to relativist theories, which means that the abolitionists were the ones who were wrong, because abolitionists says that slavery is wrong, but actually the majority of people in the culture said it's okay, because slaves are in the minority. So therefore it was okay. And I think most of us would say, no, it wasn't okay. Just because most people think it's okay doesn't mean it's okay. An entire culture can be wrong. Nazi Germany was wrong. They thought they were right, but they were wrong. So, but to say that, of course, is a realist thing. And also, if you say that, China forcibly, incarcerating the Uyghurs and trying to brainwash them into losing their religious faith, that's just wrong, even if the majority of Chinese are okay with it. We don't know if they are, of course. But who determines what the cultural standards are is another question. It might not even be the majority. It might be a very influential elite. Okay, but Sharon Street is okay with constructivism. She's attacking realism. And she says the realists, who again believe in moral facts, like in the same way, so Plato was a realist about colors. He said that there really was redness and it exists as a form, whereas other people say, no, redness doesn't exist independent of things. There's just things that are red, but redness itself is not real. So the realist about moral facts say that there's a real moral fact out there in the universe, independent of our beliefs. Okay, the realist dilemma says there's no connection between moral facts and our moral judgment. So suppose there are these moral facts, she said. Well, on the one hand, we don't know what they are. They might have no effect on our beliefs. I'm not sure if this helps, but this is like Berkeley's claim about matter. He said even if matter did exist, we wouldn't know it exists because we wouldn't be able to sense it because we can only sense things in our mind. Moral facts might be out there, and it might be that our moral judgments aren't picking up on them at all. They're not responding to them. So if that's true, then our moral judgments, we shouldn't trust them because they're not tracking what's real. Or alternatively, our moral judgments are corresponding to moral facts. But the thing is, we have no reason to believe that, she says, because all of the evolutionary theories endorse non-truth tracking accounts of the evolutionary function of the moral faculty. So all of the evolutionary theorists who've come up with explanations of why we have moral faculties, their explanations are like the tooth fairy explanation. In other words, we believe in the tooth fairy because it makes us brush our teeth, not because there really is a tooth fairy. So we believe in moral facts because it makes us cooperate, not because moral facts are true. So our reason for even if there were moral facts, our moral faculty is the product of an evolutionary process that doesn't care about those moral facts. It just cares that we believe that they're there. So therefore, we have no reason to trust that that our moral faculties correspond to anything real. So if you have a realist theory of morality, then your theory should be debunked by this. Joyce's response to this, to Sharon Street's argument, is that even if our moral faculties are not truth tracking, they could be reliably linked. For example, he says, think of blushing. Why do we blush? We blush to signal embarrassment. This is an evolutionary produced faculty that we have. What's the evolutionary explanation of why we blush? Because signaling our embarrassment leads to social cohesion, or leads people to trust you because they know that you signal your feelings. I don't know, presumably there is one. But in other words, it says that we blush not because the explanation for it is not truth tracking. It doesn't say we blush to indicate something true. However, our blushing could reliably track violation of social norms. So if you wanted to track whether or not somebody has violated a social norm, you could track their blushing and it could correlate. So even though the reason why we blush isn't caused by social norms, so it doesn't explain it in a truth-tracking way, it could still be a reliable indication of that. So even if the reason why we've acquired our moral faculties wasn't because we're genuinely responding to moral truth, but just to encourage cohesion, it might be the case that it would only work to encourage cohesion if it reliably indicated, in fact, moral truths. Couldn't that be the case? And Street's reason for discounting that is to say, oh, parsimony tells us that we shouldn't believe in moral facts once we've got the evolutionary explanation. So again, she's appealing to exactly the same move, Occam's razor, that Rouse appealed to. And of course that doesn't work on some objectivist theories like utilitarianism. Third theory of debunking, the evolutionary debunking of moral justification. Here's where, this is Joyce's account, and he uses the analogy of a belief pill. So this sounds a lot like the pills in the Matrix, because you take a pill and it affects the way you think about the world. Anyway, this belief pill, suppose you have a firmly held belief that Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo. This is, again, I'm not sure if people of your generation have this, but when people of my generation, and presumably Joyce's generation, grew up, that's one of the things you learned in school, that Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo to Admiral Nelson, a great Brit. And people still use the term so-and-so met their Waterloo. In other words, it's like somebody's doing really fine until suddenly, bam, they hit a brick wall, and that's the end of them. So Napoleon was one of the most successful generals in history, an amazing genius general, but he finally was defeated by our amazing genius Admiral Nelson at the Battle of Waterloo. Actually, no, that's Trafalgar. I'm getting them mixed up. See, my history is terrible. Battle of Waterloo is not Nelson. It's Wellington, I think. It's another Brit. I should know that because I went to school in a town named after Wellington. Wellington, Somerset. I am waffling. Okay, but the fact is that Napoleon lost this battle, the Battle of Waterloo, and I believe that. My generation all believe that. Suppose we all discovered that the only reason we believe this was not because we learnt it in school, but because someone had given us a belief pill. What effect would that have on that belief now? Well, suddenly we'd think, oh, I am no longer justified in believing that. It could be true, it could be false, but I'm no longer justified in believing it, so I should probably suspend judgment. And he says that learning that the reason why you have your moral beliefs is because they're evolutionarily adaptive is exactly like finding out that the reason why you believe that Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo is because someone gave you a pill. So, in other words, why do I believe that barbecuing babies for fun is wrong? Because it's evolutionary adaptive. Oh. In other words, I don't believe it because I found it out from fact. I just believe it because I'm kind of hardwired to believe it. That should cause me to suspend judgment. And it shouldn't cause me to think that it's false. So it's not truth debunking, but it should cause me to think that that belief is not justified. And I should therefore say, I don't know if it's true or not. Now he says, okay, a possible disanalogy is that evolution doesn't hardwire particular beliefs. And of course we've seen that because the Naga warriors' belief that beheading a foreigner is obviously not hardwired because the Nebraskan teen doesn't have it. But what they share is concepts of right and wrong. So in other words, what evolution does give us is the idea that certain things are right and certain things are wrong. Of course, we differ in which things are right and which things are wrong. So in other words, what evolution gives us is not particular beliefs, but it's the general concepts like rightness and wrongness. Okay, then he says, well, all right, then change the example so it's not a belief pill, it's a concept pill. So now you discover that your concept of, suppose you were to discover that your concept of dog is the result of a concept pill. So currently you believe that there is such a thing as dogs, and certain things are dogs and certain things are not dogs. But now you find out, oh, the only reason why you believe that there is such a concept as dog is because you've been given this pill. Suddenly you would say, well, maybe there's just animals, and it's not the case that they divide into dogs and non-dogs. And similarly, you should think maybe there isn't such a thing as right and wrong. Now he said, if it turned out that our moral faculty, that if our best evolutionary theory said that our moral faculty was truth tracking, then this would be like discovering that the person who gave us the pill was someone who only wanted us to believe in true things. So then it would still be the case that I believe that Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo because I've been given a pill. But then I know that the person who gave me the pill wants me to believe true things. So then I wouldn't be justified in exactly the same way, but I would still be fairly justified in believing it. Because I would know, even though I don't believe it because I read it in a book, I believe it because somebody made me believe it, but that person wants me to believe true things. That's like finding out that evolution has inculcated in me a belief in moral facts in a way, and evolution did it in a way that is truth tracking, just like with our numeracy. That is truth tracking. So should I believe that 2 plus 2 equals 4? Yes, because even though it's my belief that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is evolutionarily arrived at, it wouldn't have had its adaptive function if it wasn't truth tracking. However, that's not true for moral faculties. They could have their function of being adaptive without being truth tracking, because they're just supposed to make us all feel in one boat, and that can be achieved without actually being true. And then he debates, what if moral faculties just reliably correlated with the truth? That's not good enough, he said. That's like retaining our belief in Napoleon's defeat on the ground that whomever gave us the pill might be benign without knowing whether or not they're benign. They're sometimes benign, sometimes not. Okay, I hope that made the article more understandable. It might be a little bit heavy going because he tends to use a lot of jargon, but I hope I've given you some idea of what he was going on about. Now, take the test. The second